The Siege of the MacDonald Homestead. The landscape surrounding the Chenalacart in the early 19th century was a place defined by water and stillness. Located in what is now Western Ontario, the region was a dense tapestry of marshlands, slow-moving tributaries, and heavy, brooding forests that crowded the edges of the settlement. The air hung thick with moisture, blurring the horizon and dampening sound. It was a place where the separation between land and river often felt indistinct, a geography of mud and reeds that demanded constant vigilance from those who attempted to farm it. The silence of the area was not empty but heavy, filled with the drone of insects and the shifting of water against the banks. In 1829, this isolated stretch of land became the setting for a series of events that would eventually be recorded in the annals of Canadian folklore as one of the most violent and prolonged physical hauntings on record. The focus of the disturbance was the homestead of John MacDonald, a quiet and industrious man who had settled in the Baldoon settlement near Wallaceburg. The house itself was a sturdy structure, built from the timber, cleared from the property, designed to withstand the harsh winters and the humid summers of the lowlands. It was a functional, unpretentious dwelling that housed MacDonald and his family, offering shelter against the raw elements of the frontier. The disturbances began in the summer, a season usually dedicated to the hard labor of maintaining crops and livestock. The initial anomalies were easily dismissed, attributed to the natural settling of the house or the mischief of local wildlife. Members of the family reported hearing odd sounds within the walls, dull thuds that did not correspond to any known cause. At first, these noises were infrequent, occurring only at night when the house was still. They were described as the sound of something heavy dropping onto the floorboards in the empty attic, or the scratching of a large animal against the exterior logs. However, inspections of the property revealed nothing. There were no rats, no raccoons, and no loose timber that could account for the persistent, rhythmic nature of the sounds. As the weeks progressed into late June, the activity escalated from auditory to physical. The first incident to cause genuine alarm occurred on a clear afternoon when the women of the household were working in the barn. Without warning, a heavy wooden pole, part of the roof structure, dislodged itself and fell to the ground. This was followed by another and then another. The women retreated, confused by the sudden structural failure of a building that had been sound only moments before. When John MacDonald investigated, he found the beams lying on the dirt floor, but he could find no evidence of rot or breakage that would explain why they had fallen. He repaired the roof, securing the poles with fresh lashings, only to find them scattered on the ground again the following morning. The phenomenon soon moved from the outbuildings into the main house, marking a shift in intensity. The sound of footsteps became a common occurrence, heavy boots pacing the length of the loft when no one was upstairs. The family would gather in the main room, listening as the invisible walker moved back and forth above their heads. The pacing was deliberate, possessing a cadence that suggested a distinct intelligence rather than a random settling of wood. It would stop when someone climbed the ladder to investigate, only to resume the moment they returned to the ground floor. The atmosphere in the house began to change, the air growing heavy and oppressive, creating a sense of being watched that unnerved even the most skeptical visitors. It was not long before the auditory phenomena gave way to projectiles. The family was sitting at dinner one evening when a small stone dropped from the ceiling, landing on the table with a sharp clatter. It was a smooth, river-worn stone, wet as if it had just been pulled from the water. Before the family could react, another stone fell, then another. They checked the ceiling, the loft, and the windows, but found no gaps large enough to admit the stones, nor anyone outside who could have thrown them. The stones seemed to materialize out of the air itself, dropping straight down rather than flying in a trajectory that would suggest an external thrower. This phase of the haunting continued for weeks. Stones of varying sizes would crash through the windows, shattering the glass. John MacDonald, desperate to protect his home, nailed boards over the window frames, plunging the interior into permanent twilight. Yet, the stones continued to find their way inside. They would drop down the chimney, bounce off the walls, and roll across the floor. Neighbors who came to witness the events reported seeing stones rising from the riverbank and hurtling toward the house, as if propelled by a strong arm, yet the area surrounding the house was empty. Men were stationed around the perimeter of the property with muskets, watching for pranksters, but they saw no one. They stood guard for nights on end, watching the house endure a bombardment from an invisible siege force. The situation deteriorated further when the projectiles changed from stones to lead bullets. These were not fired from a gun, but appeared to be dropped or thrown with significant force. They would smash through the remaining glass or strike the walls with a sound like a hammer blow. Curiously, when the bullets struck a person, they often did so with less force than expected, dropping harmlessly to the ground after making contact. Witnesses described picking up the bullets and finding them warm to the touch. The local authorities were baffled. There was no report of gunfire, no smoke, and no flash, only the physical impact of the lead balls arriving from nowhere. By the autumn of 1829, the MacDonald family was living in a state of constant siege. The psychological toll was immense. Sleep was impossible, as the house was subjected to a nightly barrage of noise and debris. The community of Baldoon, initially skeptical, became deeply involved. People traveled from neighboring settlements to witness the phenomenon. They saw the broken windows, the bruised family members, and the piles of stones and lead that had accumulated in the corners of the rooms. The local clergy were called in to offer prayers, but the activity seemed to mock their efforts, often intensifying during religious observances. The haunting then took a more dangerous turn with the arrival of fire. Small, spontaneous fires began to break out within the house. A towel hanging on a rack would suddenly burst into flames. A pile of bedding would begin to smolder and smoke. These fires occurred in plain sight, often when multiple witnesses were present. On one occasion, a visitor watched as a small flame ignited on the cuff of his own coat. The family was forced to institute a constant fire watch, keeping buckets of water in every room. They lived in fear that the house would be consumed while they slept. The fires were not limited to the house. The outbuildings, which had been the site of the initial disturbances, became targets. The barn, filled with the season's hay, was a constant source of anxiety. Despite the family's vigilance, fires would start in the center of the haymows, in areas that were inaccessible and damp. John MacDonald and his neighbors spent hours extinguishing these blazes, only to have them reignite elsewhere. The smell of smoke became a permanent part of the atmosphere at the homestead, clinging to the clothes and hair of everyone who lived there. As winter approached, the activity shifted again, targeting the livestock. The animals on the farm became skittish and unmanageable. Horses would be found trembling in their stalls, their coats soaked with sweat as if they had been ridden hard all night. Cows would break free from their enclosures, found miles away in the dense woods. The family reported hearing the sounds of a phantom hunt, the baying of hounds, and the shouting of men echoing from the forest, though no hunters were ever seen. The oxen were found with their tails braided and knotted in intricate patterns that would have taken hours for a human to accomplish. The most disturbing aspect of the livestock phenomena involved the death of the animals. Chickens were found dead with their necks broken, a prize ox dropped dead in the field without any sign of illness or injury. The economic impact on the MacDonald family was devastating. They were losing their home, their peace of mind, and now their livelihood. The community rallied around them, offering labor and supplies, but the fear was contagious. People began to avoid the road that passed by the MacDonald property after dark, afraid of being struck by a stray stone or seeing something they could not explain. Reports from the time indicate that John MacDonald was a man pushed to the brink of ruin. he sought help from every available source. He consulted with doctors, magistrates, and indigenous elders from the nearby communities. A school teacher named Robert Barker, who fancied himself a researcher of natural phenomena, spent time at the house documenting the events. Barker recorded the trajectory of the stones and the frequency of the fires, attempting to find a scientific explanation. He noted that the stones often followed curved paths that defied the laws of physics, turning corners to enter rooms or navigating around obstacles before striking their target. One particular incident recorded by witnesses involved a cradle where the infant of the family slept. The heavy wooden cradle began to rock violently on its own, faster and faster, until it seemed it would tip over. When the mother rushed to steady it, she was thrown back by an unseen force. The baby remained asleep, undisturbed by the motion. This event was witnessed by several neighbors who had come to offer support. They described the air around the cradle as being cold, a localized drop in temperature that chilled the skin. The haunting continued into 1830, spanning nearly 2 years of relentless activity. The family was exhausted. They had moved furniture out of the house to save it from fire, living in a bare shell of a home. The windows remained boarded, the chimney blocked to prevent stones from entering. They cooked outside when the weather permitted, afraid to light the hearth indoors. The isolation of the MacDonald family deepened as the phenomenon persisted. While the community was sympathetic, there was also a growing sense of unease, a fear that whatever was afflicting the MacDonalds might spread to other households. In an effort to end the torment, John MacDonald traveled to consult with a woman known for her knowledge of the supernatural, the daughter of a man who had been involved in similar cases in the past. She lived a considerable distance away, and the journey took him several days. According to the accounts, she told him that the source of the trouble was a localized curse, potentially driven by a neighbor who coveted his land. She advised him to make a silver bullet and shoot a black goose that had been seen among his flock. The presence of this bird had been noted by the family. It was a stray that did not belong to their gaggle and seemed always to be present when the disturbances were at their peak. This element of the story, while steeped in the folklore of the era, is a matter of record in the testimonies of the time. MacDonald returned to Baldoon and fashioned a bullet from a piece of silver. He waited for the appearance of the black goose. When he spotted it near the river, he fired. The bird was struck and wounded, fleeing into the tall reeds of the marsh. MacDonald attempted to pursue it, but the terrain was too difficult, and the bird vanished into the thick vegetation. He returned to the house, unsure if his action had any effect. The following day, reports circulated in the community about an elderly woman who lived in a nearby cabin. She was a solitary figure, often at odds with her neighbors, including the MacDonalds. It was said that she had been discovered in her home suffering from a sudden and unexplained injury to her arm, a wound that corresponded to the location where the goose had been shot. The woman refused medical attention and remained secluded in her cabin. While no legal connection was ever made and no crime was ever charged, the timing of her injury coincided precisely with the shooting of the bird. Whether coincidental or causal, the activity at the MacDonald homestead ceased almost immediately after this event. The stones stopped falling, the fires no longer ignited, the sounds of pacing in the loft faded into silence. The sudden cessation of the phenomena was as jarring as its onset. The family, who had lived in a state of high adrenaline alert for 2 years, found themselves in a quiet house. The relief was palpable, but so was the lingering trauma. They had survived a prolonged assault by forces they could not understand or name. The aftermath of the Baldoon haunting left deep scars on the landscape and the people. The MacDonald house, battered and scorched, stood as a testament to the ordeal. The family worked to repair the damage, replacing the roof and the windows, scrubbing the soot from the walls. But the story of what happened there became a permanent part of the local history. The location was regarded with superstition for generations. People would point out the site as they passed, recounting the stories of the stones that flew like birds and the fires that started from nothing. Historians and researchers who have examined the Baldoon case have noted the sheer volume of witnesses. This was not a story told by a single frightened individual in the dark. It was a public event, witnessed by dozens of people in broad daylight. The stones were held in the hands of skeptics, the fires were extinguished by the bucket brigades of the community, the bullet holes in the walls remained visible for years, physical proof of the violence that had occurred. The sheer duration of the event, lasting nearly 2 years, sets it apart from fleeting paranormal encounters. It was a sustained occupation of a domestic space. The nature of the phenomena at Baldoon shares characteristics with what is now classified as poltergeist activity, the movement of objects, the targeted fires, the noises. However, the intensity and the aggressive nature of the projectiles were unusual. The stones did not just fall, they were thrown with intent. The bullets suggested a mimicry of human violence, a ghostly reflection of the weaponry of the time. The events seemed designed to drive the family out, to make the land uninhabitable. It was a territorial dispute between the living and the unseen. In the years that followed, the MacDonald family continued to farm the land, though the memory of the siege never fully faded. The children who had grown up amidst the crashing stones and sudden fires carried the stories with them into adulthood. The narrative was preserved in family letters and local newspaper articles, which treated the events not as a ghost story, but as a matter of public record, a series of unexplained calamities that had befallen a respected neighbor. The tone of these early reports was one of bewilderment rather than sensationalism. The environment of the Chenal Acart likely played a role in the atmosphere of the haunting. The isolation, the swamp gases, and the unique acoustics of the river valley created a setting where reality could feel malleable. Some theories suggested that the phenomena were the result of natural gas leaks or seismic activity, but these explanations failed to account for the intelligence behind the disturbances, the way the stones targeted specific windows, or the way the fires avoided consuming the entire house, starting only in small, controllable bursts until the family was worn down. The legacy of the Baldoon mystery is one of unresolved tension. There was no definitive explanation ever provided. The connection to the elderly neighbor and the silver bullet remains in the realm of folklore, a narrative device used to make sense of the chaos. The reality of what happened inside the MacDonald house was likely far more complex and terrifying than the legend suggests. It was a breakdown of the natural order, a period of time where the laws of physics seemed to be suspended within the boundaries of a single property. Today, the site of the haunting is quiet. The original buildings are long gone, reclaimed by the earth and the passage of time. The landscape has changed, drained, and cultivated, the wild marshes tamed. But the accounts remain preserved in the archives of Ontario history. They tell of a time when a family was besieged by an invisible enemy, when the sanctity of the home was violated by forces that defied explanation. The stones of Baldoon may have stopped falling, but the echo of their impact resonates in the silence of the historical record. The specific details of the fires remain particularly baffling to modern researchers. The descriptions of cold fire flames that consumed fabric but did not immediately burn the skin appear in several witness accounts. This detail, often overlooked in summaries, suggests a phenomenon that was not purely thermal combustion. It aligns with other historical poltergeist cases where thermodynamic anomalies were reported. The fires were almost theatrical in their presentation, appearing in the center of a room or on a person's clothing, demanding immediate attention and creating a chaotic spectacle. The behavior of the bullets is equally strange. The fact that they were described as warm but traveled with low velocity upon impact suggests they were not fired from a charge of gunpowder. A bullet fired from a musket would be hot from friction and the explosion, and it would embed itself deeply in wood or flesh. These bullets dropped or were lobbed, yet they possessed enough mass to break glass. It was as if they were being teleported or manifested rather than shot. The collection of lead balls that the family accumulated became a tangible curiosity, a pile of ammunition for a war that had no soldiers. Witnesses also noted the psychological state of the family. They were described not as hysterical, but as grimly determined. John MacDonald was a pragmatist, a man who built his life with his hands. To be confronted with a problem he could not fix with a hammer or a gun was deeply destabilizing. The accounts describe him sitting in his chair, watching the stones fall, his face set in a mask of resignation. He was a man under siege, holding his ground against an enemy he could not see. The role of the community in the Baldoon mystery is significant. In many haunting cases, the victims are isolated and disbelieved. In Baldoon, the community was present, they brought food, they stood guard, they witnessed the events firsthand. This collective witnessing lends the case a weight that is often lacking in other reports. It was not a private delusion, it was a communal crisis. The fear that the infection would spread was a very real concern for the neighbors. They worried that whatever door had been opened at the MacDonald farm might not be easily closed. As the narrative of the Baldoon mystery was retold over the decades, it acquired layers of interpretation. The romanticized version focuses on the silver bullet and the witch, a satisfying conclusion where good triumphs over evil. But the raw data of the case, the 2 years of grinding daily torment, tells a different story. It tells of a survival situation, of a family living in a combat zone within their own walls. It speaks to the fragility of safety and the terrifying realization that the walls we build to keep the world out are permeable to forces we do not understand. The final days of the haunting were marked by an escalation that seemed unsustainable. The fires were becoming more frequent, the damage more severe. It felt as though the phenomenon was building toward a catastrophic conclusion. The sudden stop was the only mercy the family received. When the noise finally ceased, the silence that followed must have been deafening. They waited for the next stone, the next crash, but it never came. The siege was over, leaving them to pick up the pieces of their shattered domesticity. Even now, the story of the Baldoon mystery serves as a reminder of the unknowns that permeate the history of the frontier. It is a narrative of endurance, of a family that refused to be driven from their land despite the overwhelming pressure to leave. It remains one of Canada's most compelling historical mysteries, a sequence of events that resists easy categorization and refuses to be fully explained. The image of the stones rising from the river, dripping wet and cold to strike the house of John MacDonald, is an enduring portrait of the uncanny, a moment where the natural world turned against the people who sought to tame it. The archival records from the era, including the diaries of traveling ministers and the letters of local officials, corroborate the timeline of events. They speak of a great disturbance in the Baldoon settlement, of a visitation that troubled the peace of the entire district. These documents do not offer solutions, they merely record the facts of the disruption. They serve as a sterile, bureaucratic confirmation of the chaos that engulfed the MacDonald homestead. They stand as a sober counterpoint to the more fantastic elements of the oral tradition. In the end, the MacDonald family's experience at Baldoon stands as a singular event in the history of the paranormal. It was not a fleeting glimpse of a ghost or a momentary chill. It was a physical assault, a tangible, destructive force that operated with impunity for months on end. It challenged the rationality of everyone who witnessed it, forcing hard-headed pioneers to confront the possibility that their world was not as solid or predictable as they believed. The mystery of what truly happened in that house near the Shinaila cart remains locked in the past, hidden in the silence of the vanished wetlands. The St. Catherine's disturbance. The events that took place in the summer of 1970 inches, St. Catharines, Ontario, represent one of the most rigorously documented cases of unexplained physical phenomena in Canadian history. It wasn't a situation that happened in a crumbling Gothic mansion or an isolated farmhouse on the edge of a dark forest. It happened in a completely mundane, modern apartment building on Church Street. The location was unremarkable in every way, which is part of what made the subsequent weeks so difficult for the local community to process. This wasn't a story about ghost hunters or psychics looking for attention. It was a story about regular police officers, engineers, and doctors who walked into a standard two-bedroom apartment and watched the laws of physics seemingly break down in front of their eyes. The apartment in question was Unit 4 at 237 Church Street. It was occupied by a family that, by all accounts, was trying to live a quiet life. The household consisted of a mother and her children, and for a long time, there was nothing to report. The neighbors knew them, the landlord knew them, and there were no prior complaints of noise or strange behavior. The trouble didn't start with a bang. It started with the kind of low-level annoyances that people usually dismiss as accidents or forgetfulness. It was the middle of summer, a humid August, when the atmosphere inside the apartment began to shift. At first, it was just small things. Items wouldn't be where they were left. A cup set on a counter would be found on the floor, a chair pulled out from the table would be pushed back in. For the first few days, the family assumed they were just getting in each other's way. With kids in the house, things get moved. That is the rational explanation, but the activity didn't stay at that level. It ramped up quickly, moving from small displacements to audible disturbances. They started hearing knocks. These weren't the settling noises of a building cooling down at night or the pipes rattling in the walls. These were distinct, rhythmic raps that seemed to come from the walls themselves and sometimes from the furniture. The mother, trying to keep a level head, checked the plumbing, she checked for drafts, she looked for rodents. There was no physical cause that she could find, but the knocking persisted. It was annoying, but it wasn't terrifying yet. It was just a puzzle that they couldn't solve. The escalation point hit around the middle of August. The subtle movements of small objects stopped being subtle. Furniture began to slide across the floor without anyone touching it. This is where the psychological toll really began to set in. It is one thing to misplace your keys. It is another thing entirely to watch a heavy dining chair drag itself a few inches across the linoleum. The family was frightened, but they also questioned their own sanity. They didn't want to call for help because they knew how it would sound. They didn't want to be the people calling the police about a haunted apartment. But eventually, the fear outweighed the embarrassment. The activity became aggressive, and they felt unsafe in their own home. They contacted the authorities. This is a crucial distinction between this case and many folklore legends. In legends, people call a priest or a local wise woman. In St. Catharines, they called the police. They treated it as a civil disturbance or a potential intruder situation. Officers from the St. Catharines Police Department were dispatched to the scene. When they arrived, they likely expected a domestic dispute or perhaps a prank being played by the children. They were prepared to take a statement, look around, and tell everyone to calm down. They were not prepared for what they were about to witness. Constable Bob Richardson was one of the officers who responded to the call. His testimony, along with that of his colleagues, forms the backbone of the historical record for this case. These were trained observers. Their job was to document facts, collect evidence, and keep the peace. When Richardson and other officers entered the apartment, they did a thorough sweep. They checked for wires, they checked for hidden accomplices, they looked for magnets or trick floorboards. They were looking for the fraud because that is what police work dictates. You eliminate the impossible, and whatever is left, however unlikely, must be the truth. But in this case, the truth didn't make sense. During one of the initial visits, the officers were standing in the living room interviewing the mother. While they were taking notes, they witnessed a chair slide across the floor. It didn't just vibrate or tip over, it moved laterally. The officers immediately jumped into action, not to fight a ghost, but to find the string. They assumed someone was pulling it. They examined the chair, the floor, and the surrounding area. There was no string, there was no wire, there was no mechanism. The officers were baffled. They filed reports detailing exactly what they saw, using professional, non-emotional language to describe an event that defied explanation. The activity wasn't limited to the living room, it seemed to focus on the bedroom shared by the children, specifically around an 11-year-old boy named Peter. This fits a pattern often seen in these types of cases, where the phenomena seem anchored to a specific individual, often an adolescent. The police documented that the bed in the room would rise off the floor. We aren't talking about a slight wobble. Reports state that one end of the bed lifted several inches into the air and then dropped back down. This happened while the boy was on it, and sometimes when he wasn't. The officers checked the bed frame, they checked under the mattress, they looked for hydraulics. There was nothing there but a standard bed frame. As the days went on, the intensity of the phenomena increased. It wasn't just sliding chairs anymore. Heavy objects were being thrown. A heavy bureau, weighing a significant amount, was reported to have tipped over or moved on its own. This is where the physical danger became real. If a chair slides, it's spooky. If a dresser falls on you, it's a hospital visit. The police were now spending a significant amount of time at the apartment, not just investigating, but practically standing guard. They were trying to protect the family from their own furniture. The sheer number of witnesses began to grow. It wasn't just one tired officer on a night shift, it was multiple officers on different shifts, all corroborating the same impossible events. The police decided to bring in outside experts. They acknowledged that this was outside their jurisdiction of expertise. They weren't ghost hunters, so they reached out to professionals who might have a better understanding of physics or psychology. They brought in engineers, doctors, and even a physicist. The goal was to debunk the situation. They wanted someone to come in and point out the loose floorboard or the seismic vibration from a nearby truck that was causing everything. They wanted a rational exit strategy from the case. A local doctor, Dr. George Owen, who was also a mathematician and geneticist, became involved. He was a serious academic, not a fringe theorist. He approached the situation with a scientific mindset. He visited the apartment and interviewed the family. He observed the boy. He observed the environment. During his time there, he didn't just take stories, he witnessed the phenomena himself. He saw objects move. He heard the percussive sounds that couldn't be traced to a source. He noted that the events seemed to happen more frequently when the 11-year-old boy was present or in a high state of emotional tension. This aligned with the theory of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, or RSPK, which suggests that the human mind, under extreme stress, can project energy that affects the physical environment. The community of St. Catharines was starting to talk. You can't have police cruisers parked outside an apartment building night after night without rumors flying. The local press got wind of it, and the story began to circulate. However, the police kept a tight lid on the official details to protect the family. They didn't want a circus, they wanted a solution. The housing authority was also involved because the property was technically under their management. They inspected the building for structural faults, they checked the foundation, they checked the plumbing and electrical systems. They found nothing that could account for a dresser levitating or a chair chasing a police officer across the room. One of the most disturbing incidents recorded involved a heavy armchair. According to the reports, an officer was sitting in the living room keeping watch. He was fully awake, alert, and on duty. He watched as a large armchair levitated a few inches off the floor, hovered for a moment, and then settled back down. It didn't scrape, it didn't drag, it lifted. The officer checked for fishing lines, he checked for magnets, he found nothing. This wasn't a trick of the light, this was a heavy piece of furniture defying gravity. The officer's report reflects a deep sense of unease. It is rare to see official police documentation where the writing style betrays a sense of helplessness, but it was present here. The family was falling apart, the mother was exhausted, the children were terrified, they couldn't sleep. Every time they closed their eyes, a noise would startle them or their bed would shake. The 11-year-old boy, Peter, was the center of it all, and he was suffering. He was being poked and prodded by doctors. He was being questioned by police. He was living in a home that felt like it was attacking him. The stress loop was self-perpetuating. The more stressed he got, the more active the phenomena became. The more active the phenomena became, the more stressed he got. It was a cycle that showed no signs of breaking. The police tried to separate the boy from the environment to see if that would stop the activity. They found that when Peter left the apartment quieted down. But the activity sometimes seemed to follow him, or at least the potential for activity did. This strongly supported the RSPK theory. It wasn't the apartment that was haunted, it was the situation. The energy was coming from the living, not the dead. This was a crucial realization for the investigators. They weren't fighting a ghost, they were dealing with a massive, uncontrolled release of psychic or kinetic energy from a troubled child. During the height of the investigation, a physicist from a nearby university was brought in. He brought equipment to measure vibrations and electromagnetic fields. He wanted hard data. He set up his instruments in the apartment and waited. The instruments picked up anomalies, but nothing that made sense in the context of standard physics. There were no earthquakes, there were no heavy trucks passing by at the exact moments of the disturbances. The vibrations were localized. They were happening in the room, not to the building. The physicist left the apartment, scratching his head, unable to provide the police with the rational explanation they were desperate for. There was an incident involving a picture on the wall. It didn't just fall. Witnesses claimed it flew across the room and smashed against the opposite wall. If a picture falls due to a bad nail, it drops straight down. For a picture to hit the opposite wall, force has to be applied. It requires a vector. Someone or something has to throw it. But there was no one standing there. The room was clear. The police were watching. The trajectory was impossible unless an invisible arm had hurled it. These purely kinetic displays were aggressive. They felt violent. It wasn't just mischief. It felt like a temper tantrum expressed through furniture. The police reports also mention a strange piling phenomenon. Objects would be found piled up in the center of the room. Chairs, books, toys, anything loose would be stacked in a precarious tower. This would happen in the span of a few minutes while the room was empty. The mother would walk into the kitchen, come back 2 minutes later, and find a barricade of furniture in the living room. The speed at which this happened was baffling. To stack furniture that quietly and that quickly would require a team of movers working in total silence. Yet, the apartment was small and the family was accounted for. As August turned into September, the situation became untenable. The family could not stay there. The police could not stay there forever. The landlord was unhappy with the constant presence of authorities and the damage being done to the unit. There were gouges in the floors from sliding furniture. There were marks on the walls. The apartment was getting wrecked. The decision was made that the family had to move. It was a surrender. They couldn't stop it, so they had to leave it. The move itself was tense. There was a fear that the activity would follow them to the new place. The police assisted with the move, perhaps partly to help, but also to observe. They wanted to see if the infection would transfer. The family moved out of the Church Street apartment, leaving the empty rooms behind. The activity in the apartment ceased immediately. Once the boy and his family were gone, Unit 4 went back to being a normal, quiet apartment. The knocking stopped, the furniture stayed put, the next tenants reported absolutely nothing unusual. However, the activity didn't vanish from the family's life instantly, but it did fade. Once the pressure of the specific location and the intense scrutiny was removed, the phenomena tapered off. This is also typical of RSPK cases. They tend to burn out. The energy required to levitate a bureau is massive, and it seems that the human system can't sustain that level of output for long. The boy grew up. The stress of that specific summer dissipated. The events became a memory, documented in police files and medical journals, but the active haunting was over. The aftermath of the St. Catharines case left a legacy in the field of parapsychology and police work in Canada. It stands out because of the credibility of the witnesses. These weren't people telling stories around a campfire. These were hostile witnesses, in a sense. The police didn't want to see what they saw. They didn't want to write those reports. They did it because they had to. They were sworn to uphold the truth, and the truth was that furniture was flying around the room. The inclusion of doctors and scientists added another layer of weight to the case. One interesting footnote in the investigation was the psychological profile of the family. The father was absent, and the mother was working hard to keep everything together. The dynamics of the household were strained even before the plates started flying. The theory that the boy was the epicenter suggests that he was acting as a lightning rod for the family's collective tension. The furniture moving was a physical manifestation of emotional turmoil. It's a theory that makes the horror slightly more manageable. It brings it back to the human element rather than demons or spirits. But theories don't explain the mechanics. How does emotional stress translate into the kinetic energy required to lift a 600-pound dresser? That is the question that the physicist couldn't answer. That is the question that kept the police officers up at night. You can talk about mind over matter, but seeing it in action is a visceral shock. It violates the basic agreement we have with reality. We trust that the floor will stay down and the chair will stay still. When that trust is broken, the feeling of safety evokes a primal fear. The St. Catharines case remains one of the few instances where a police force officially acknowledged the presence of unexplained phenomena without charging anyone with fraud or mischief. Usually, if the police catch a poltergeist, they find a roll of fishing line and a mischievous teenager. In this case, they found nothing but questions. They closed the file not because they solved it, but because the events stopped. There was no arrest. There was no conviction. There was just a quiet apartment and a stack of reports describing the impossible. Decades later, the case is rarely discussed outside of specialized circles. It doesn't have a movie deal. It doesn't have a catchy name like the Amityville Horror. It is just the St. Catharines case. But for the people who were there, for the officers who felt the wind of a flying object pass their heads, it was the most defining moment of their careers. They walked into a room expecting a domestic dispute and walked out having seen the fabric of reality tear open. The apartment building on Church Street still stands. People live there today. Most of them probably have no idea what happened in Unit 4 Inches the summer of 1970. They walk across the same floors where chairs once slid on their own. They sleep in the same space where a bed once levitated. The walls have been painted over, the carpets replaced. But the history is there, buried in the archives of the local police department, a testament to a few weeks when the impossible became the routine. The investigation files reveal the sheer volume of incidents. It wasn't one or two things, it was hundreds of movements over the course of a few weeks. The persistence of the phenomena is what wore everyone down. You can handle one strange event. You can rationalize it. But when it happens 10 times a day, every day, you lose the ability to deny it. The mother's testimony speaks of a profound exhaustion. She wasn't just scared, she was tired. She was tired of putting the house back together. She was tired of the police. She was tired of the noise. The role of the media in this case was also interesting. The local paper, the St. Catharines Standard, covered the events, but the sensationalism was kept relatively in check compared to modern standards. There was a respect for the privacy of the family. The reporters relied on the police statements rather than harassing the tenants. This allowed the investigation to proceed with a level of dignity that is often missing in high-profile paranormal cases. It remained a local mystery rather than a national circus. One specific detail that often gets overlooked is the sound. Witnesses describe the sounds not just as knocks, but as explosive cracks. It sounded like a pistol shot inside the wall. This auditory component is common in poltergeist cases, but the volume here was notable. It wasn't a subtle tapping, it was a violent sound designed to demand attention. The police officers reported hearing these sounds while standing right next to the wall, unable to feel any vibration, yet the sound was deafening. It was as if the sound originated from the air itself rather than the structure. The skepticism of the initial responding officers makes their eventual conversion all the more compelling. There is a record of one officer who openly mocked the call before arriving at the scene. He was convinced it was a prank. Hours later, that same officer was the one helping to push a heavy dresser back against the wall after it had tipped over on its own. The transformation from cynic to witness is a powerful narrative arc that plays out in the official notes. They didn't want to believe, but they were given no choice. In the years since, researchers have looked back at the St. Catharines case as a perfect poltergeist case. It had all the classic elements: a focal agent, the boy, a short duration, violent kinetic effects, and credible witnesses. It lacks the religious overtones of demonic possession cases. There were no voices, no messages, no religious iconography defiled. It was purely mechanical. It was a raw force. It was like living in a house with a gravity malfunction. This lack of intelligence or personality in the phenomena suggests a biological or psychological origin rather than a spiritual one. The family eventually faded into obscurity. They didn't write a book, they didn't go on a talk show tour, they just wanted to move on. This silence speaks volumes. Usually, when people perpetrate a hoax, they do it for attention or money. The family in St. Catharines got neither. They got evicted and they got trauma. They lost their home and their standing in the neighborhood. There was no upside for them. This lack of motive is another strong piece of evidence against the hoax theory. Why would a mother destroy her own apartment and risk losing her housing just to trick the police? The St. Catharines disturbance challenges our understanding of the human mind and its potential interaction with the physical world. If the RSPK theory is correct, it implies that we all have the potential to move mountains, or at least furniture, if the emotional pressure is high enough. It suggests that the monsters aren't under the bed, they are inside us, waiting for a crack in the dam to let the energy out. The events of 1970 showed us that the line between the psychological and the physical is not as solid as we think. Even today, looking at the grainy photocopies of the police reports, you can feel the tension in the room. You can imagine the cigarette smoke, the heavy wool uniforms of the police, the humid Ontario summer air, and the silence before a lamp goes flying. It is a snapshot of a moment when the world stopped making sense. The officers did their duty. They observed, they reported, and they protected. But they couldn't explain. And 50 years later, we still can't. The legacy of the case is a quiet one. It serves as a data point for researchers, a reference for serious investigators, and a spooky story for the locals who remember. But mostly, it stands as a reminder of the limits of our knowledge. We have mapped the globe and split the atom, but we still don't know why a chair in a St. Catherine's apartment decided to slide across the floor in August of 1970. The mystery remains intact, preserved in the silence of the archives, waiting for an answer that may never come. The disturbance ended, but the questions it raised are still hanging in the air, much like the objects in that small apartment on Church Street. The fire spook of Caledonia Mills. The winter of 1,922 inches, Nova Scotia, was defined by a brutal, unrelenting cold that froze the ground several feet deep and turned the rural landscape into a white, silent expanse. In the isolated farming district of Caledonia Mills, located in Antigonish County, the isolation was not merely a geographical fact, but a psychological reality. The farms were spaced far apart, separated by dense stretches of timber and snow-choked roads that were often impassable for days at a time. It was in this setting of extreme solitude and environmental hardship that one of the most disturbing and well-documented cases of paranormal activity in Canadian history unfolded. The event centered on the farmhouse of Alexander MacDonald, a respectable and elderly farmer who lived there with his wife and their adopted daughter, Mary Ellen, who was 15 years old at the time. The narrative of what occurred in that house has been pieced together from contemporary newspaper reports, the sworn testimony of neighbors, police records, and the detailed case files of the psychical researchers who eventually descended upon the property. It is a story that begins with small incongruities and escalates into a survival situation where the very elements of the home seem to turn against its inhabitants. The MacDonald farm was a typical structure for the region and era. A wooden, two-story house heated by wood stoves with no electricity and reliant on oil lamps for light. The family lived a life of routine and hard labor, deeply rooted in the Catholic faith and the Gaelic traditions of their Scottish ancestors. In mid-January of 1922, this routine was shattered by the onset of auditory phenomena that defied easy explanation. Initially, the sounds were dismissed as the natural settling of the house in the severe frost, the groaning of timbers, or the shifting of the foundation. However, the noises soon became distinct and rhythmic. The family reported hearing heavy, booted footsteps pacing the floor of the upper attic when the entire household was gathered in the kitchen below. Alexander MacDonald, a man described by his neighbors as practical and not given to flights of fancy, would take a lantern and climb the narrow stairs to investigate, only to find the attic empty, the dust on the floorboards undisturbed, and the windows latched tight against the winter wind. The auditory disturbances were merely the prelude to a more aggressive phase of activity that began to manifest within days. Physical objects in the house started to behave in ways that violated the laws of physics as the family understood them. It began with small displacements, items vanishing from their usual spots and reappearing in unlikely locations. A heavy weaving loom, a fixture of the household's domestic work, was reported to have been tampered with, parts of it dismantled or moved when no one was in the room. This escalation from noise to physical interaction created an atmosphere of profound unease. The sanctity of the home, the one place of safety against the harsh Canadian winter, was being violated by an unseen agency. The psychological toll on the family was immediate. Sleep became difficult, and the tension in the house rose with each passing night. The situation transitioned from unsettling to dangerous with the outbreak of the fires. This is the aspect of the Caledonia Mills case that sets it apart from typical haunting narratives and places it into the category of a fire poltergeist, or unexplained incendiary phenomenon. The first fires were small and seemingly impossible. The family would smell smoke and rush to find a small blaze starting in a corner of a room, on a piece of wallpaper, or in a pile of fabric. These were not fires that had spread from the stove or the hearth. They were isolated points of combustion that appeared spontaneously in cold rooms. On one particularly chaotic day, reports state that over 30 separate fires broke out within the house between morning and evening. The family was forced into a state of constant vigilance, forming a bucket brigade within their own home, unable to rest for fear that the structure would burn down around them while they slept. The nature of these fires was a subject of intense scrutiny by the neighbors who came to help. In a rural community like Caledonia Mills, a distress signal from a neighbor was answered immediately. Men from the surrounding farms, including the McGillivray and Carroll families, arrived to assist the McDonalds. These were experienced farmers who understood fire, wood, and combustion. They witnessed events that they could not reconcile with their understanding of the world. One neighbor, Alex McGillivray, provided a sworn account of seeing wet towels, which had been hung out to dry, suddenly burst into flames. The fire was described as blue and quick, consuming the surface of the fabric before being extinguished. The anomaly of wet cloth igniting without an external heat source was deeply disturbing to the witnesses. It suggested that the fires were not the result of accidents or standard arson, but something else entirely. As the phenomena intensified, the McDonald family was forced to flee their home. They sought refuge in the houses of their neighbors, hoping that the distance would provide safety. However, the phenomena appeared to be attached to the family itself rather than the location. Reports from the neighbors' homes indicated that small fires and movements of objects continued to occur in the presence of the McDonalds, specifically when Mary Ellen was nearby. This led to a growing suspicion and fear within the community. The fire spook, as it came to be called, was no longer just a problem for Alexander McDonald, it was a threat to anyone who harbored them. The social dynamic of the community began to fracture under the stress, with fear mingling with sympathy for the plight of the elderly couple and their daughter. The case garnered significant attention from the press, with newspapers in Halifax and beyond running sensational headlines about the mystery farm and the ghost of Caledonia Mills. This publicity brought a new wave of observers, curiosity seekers, and eventually, the authorities. The local police were baffled. They investigated the possibility of arson, as was their duty. They looked for accelerants, matches, or devices that could have set the fires. They found nothing. The sheer frequency of the ignitions, sometimes happening in front of witnesses who were watching the occupants closely, made it difficult to build a case for human deception. How could a teenage girl or an elderly man strike a match and light a fire on a wall 10 feet away without being seen by a room full of people? The lack of a rational explanation forced the authorities to leave the case open and unresolved. It was at this juncture that Dr. Walter Franklin Prince entered the narrative. Dr. Prince was a renowned researcher from the American Society for Psychical Research in New York. He was a man of science, a skeptic by trade, and a psychologist who specialized in the study of dissociation and abnormal psychology. He traveled to Nova Scotia in late February 1922 to conduct a formal investigation. His arrival marked a shift in the case from a local folklore event to a subject of serious inquiry. Prince did not stay in a hotel. He moved into the farmhouse with the family and the neighbors who were guarding them. He subjected the household to a rigorous protocol of observation, documenting the temperature, the humidity, the movements of every person, and the exact timeline of every reported incident. Prince's investigation took place during a ferocious blizzard that sealed the farm off from the outside world. For several days, he was trapped with the family, providing him with a unique opportunity to observe the domestic dynamics in a pressure cooker environment. He noted the extreme stress that Alexander McDonald was under, a man watching his life's work and his home being dismantled by forces he couldn't fight. Prince also focused his attention on Mary Ellen. He observed that she was a quiet, somewhat withdrawn teenager who seemed to be at the center of the activity. Prince was careful to note that he did not believe she was maliciously faking the phenomena for attention. Instead, he began to formulate a theory based on the psychological concepts of the time. During his stay, Prince witnessed several phenomena himself, although he always stopped short of declaring them paranormally proven. He saw objects that had moved while his back was turned. He smelled the smoke of fires that started in empty rooms. However, in his final report, he leaned heavily toward a theory of automatism. He posited that Mary Ellen, suffering from the stress of her environment and possible cognitive challenges, was entering a dissociative state. In this state, he argued, she was surreptitiously starting the fires and moving the objects using sleight of hand that was so practiced and unconscious that she herself might not have been aware of it. He suggested that her senses were heightened, allowing her to act with incredible speed and stealth, fooling the watchful eyes of her parents and the neighbors. This explanation, while scientifically palatable to the academic community in New York, did not sit well with the witnesses in Caledonia Mills. The farmers who had stood watch in the kitchen disputed the idea that a young girl could outwit them all. They pointed to the heavy furniture that had been overturned items that would require the strength of a grown man to move. They cited the fires that started on ceilings or in places Mary Ellen could not reach without a ladder. There was a fundamental disconnect between the clinical analysis of the outsider and the visceral, terrifying experience of the locals. To the people who smelled the smoke and felt the heat, the automatism theory felt insufficient to explain the violence and the physics of what they had seen. One of the most unsettling aspects of the case, often overshadowed by the fires, was the effect on the livestock. Witnesses reported that the cattle in the barn would become terrified for no apparent reason, breaking their tethers and injuring themselves. On one occasion, the cattle were found to have been moved or tied in complex knots that would have taken time to arrange. Yet, it happened within minutes. Animals are often cited in folklore as being sensitive to supernatural presence, and their distress added a layer of primal fear to the events. It signaled that the disturbance was not limited to the house, but permeated the entire property. The McDonalds were farmers. The safety of their animals was paramount. The chaos in the barn was as devastating to them as the fires in the parlor. The culmination of the events came with the removal of Mary Ellen from the home. Following the advice of authorities and perhaps the subtle pressure of the community, she was taken to a mental health institution, a common and often tragic fate for individuals in that era who became the center of unexplained disturbances. Almost immediately after her departure, the fires at the McDonald farm ceased. The heavy footsteps in the attic stopped. The cattle calmed down. For Dr. Prince, this was the final proof of his theory. Remove the agent and the phenomena ends. It was a neat, logical conclusion to the investigation. However, the aftermath of the haunting left a permanent scar on the landscape and the community. The McDonalds did not stay in the house long after the events. The structure, tainted by the memories of that winter and the stigma of the spook, was abandoned. It stood empty for years, a dark monument in the fields of Caledonia Mills. Local lore tells of people avoiding the road that passed the farm after dark. The house eventually fell into ruin, reclaimed by the harsh Nova Scotia weather, rotting into the earth until only the cellar hole remained. The physical evidence of the fires, the scorched wood, the burnt wallpaper disappeared, leaving only the oral history and the written reports. The ambiguity of the Caledonia Mills mystery lies in the details that Prince's report could not fully explain. There were incidents recorded by the police where Mary Ellen was physically restrained or under direct observation when a fire broke out in another room. There were the blue flames that burned cold, damaging only the surface of objects. There was the sheer volume of incidents, hundreds over the course of a few weeks, that would have required a logistical mastermind to execute without detection. The skepticism of the era dismissed these outliers as observation errors, but for modern researchers of the paranormal, they represent the poltergeist signature, a chaotic, high-energy disturbance that mimics human agency but exceeds human capability. The story of the Caledonia Mills fire spook is also a tragedy of isolation. It highlights the vulnerability of a family living on the edge of civilization, reliant on themselves and their neighbors for survival. When that support network was threatened by the inexplicable, the psychological damage was profound. Alexander MacDonald died not long after the events, a man broken by the loss of his home and his standing in the community. Mary Ellen lived out her life in obscurity, forever marked by the winter of 1922. The human cost of the haunting was real, regardless of whether the cause was supernatural or psychological. In the decades that followed, the case became a staple of Nova Scotian folklore, but it retained a level of credibility that other stories lacked due to the involvement of Dr. Prince and the existence of police files. It was not a campfire tale invented to scare children, it was a matter of public record. The fire marshal's office had been involved. The American Society for Psychical Research had published a book on it. The events had a weight and a density that resisted easy dismissal. It remains one of the few cases where a poltergeist was investigated as a potential arsonist by the state, blurring the line between criminal investigation and paranormal research. The recurring theme of the fire starter in paranormal literature often centers on an adolescent, leading to theories about psychokinetic energy released during puberty. While this remains a pseudoscience, the Caledonia Mills case fits the profile perfectly. The energy in the house was described as electric. Witnesses felt a heaviness in the air before a fire started. Some reported a prickling sensation on their skin. These physiological reactions suggest that the environment itself was charged, creating conditions where combustion became possible. Whether this was generated by Mary Ellen's mind or by an external entity feeding off her energy is the question that remains unanswered. The final analysis of the Caledonia Mills mystery forces us to confront the limits of our perception. The neighbors who sat in that kitchen, watching the stove and the walls, were not superstitious fools. They were practical, hard-headed people who knew the difference between a trick and a threat. They saw things that terrified them. They saw wet towels burn. They saw heavy looms slide across the floor. To dismiss their testimony entirely is to display an arrogance of the present over the past. They were there, we were not. They smelled the smoke, we only read the reports. Today, the site of the MacDonald farm is quiet. The snow still falls just as heavily in Antigonish County, burying the hills in silence. But for those who know the history, the land is still charged with the memory of that winter. It stands as a reminder that the boundary between the domestic and the uncanny is thinner than we like to believe. We build our houses to keep the nature out, to keep the cold at bay, and to create a safe space for our families. But in 1922, in a farmhouse in Nova Scotia, something demonstrated that the walls could not protect the inhabitants from a force that was already inside. The legacy of the fire spook of Caledonia Mills is not just a ghost story. It is a documented historical event where the rational world collided with the irrational, and for a period of 2 months, the irrational won. The fires eventually stopped, but the questions they raised continue to burn in the archives of the unexplained, leaving a smoke trail that leads back to a lonely, frozen farm and a mystery that will likely never be fully solved.